Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jenny Koch, and I'm a Senior Associate and Planner with RHI, Roadside and Harwell. But today I'm representing the Sustainable Communities Division of APA, which is the host for today's webinar. And today's webinar is called Climate of Crisis, How Cities Can Use Climate Action to Close the Equity Gap, Drive Economic Recovery, and Improve Public Health. All things we've all been thinking a lot about in the past few months. So we'll get into that more in a second. But I want to note, if you're having any technical issues, just send me a chat. My name on here is APASCD, and I'll get you started once we kick off with Dr. Cutler in just a second. But first, before we move on, I need to acknowledge our great sponsors. Thank you, as always and as ever, to these organizations to help us put on events like this webinar. Our sponsors for this year include Clarion, Devon's Enterprise Commission, Dewberry, East End Land Planning, FAR Associates, HAF, Niche Engineering, Ideation and Planning, Mars EOR, Robinson and Cole, Smith Group, TESCA, the University of Florida Online Masters of Urban and Regional Planning, the University of Utah Department of City and Metropolitan Planning, Urban Works, Urban Ecoplan, the Urban Collective, and VHB. So thank you again to all of those sponsors and to all of our division members. If you're interested in learning more about the division or have some ideas you want to share or want to get involved, feel free to reach out to us here. I want to note we'll have a new website up soon, so that's something to watch out for. But also, speaking of things to watch out for, we've got several upcoming events after this one. It's award season coming up for us in several ways. In the coming weeks, we'll have a series of webinars with our 2020 award winners. I'm excited for that. First up, we've got a webinar next Thursday with the winners in the policy, law, or tool category and the energy category, which was new this year. Let's see, the formatting looks a little bit weird on this slide, but you can find out more if you go to our website. You can also register there. One other thing to look out for in the coming weeks is an announcement about the 2021 awards period. We'll be opening up soon for nominations, and we hope you'll want to be involved with that. So please keep an eye on the website or sign up for our e-bulletins to find out more when information is available. But most importantly, on to today's event. So as I mentioned, today's event is called Climate of Crisis. And it's related to a recent report of that same name, Climate of Crisis, How Cities Can Use Climate Action to Close the Equity Gap, Drive Economic Recovery, and Improve Public Health. And so Dr. Cutler Cleveland is here to discuss ways that planners and local officials can think about responses to the events of this year, ranging from the COVID pandemic to severe recession, a wave of protests, and ongoing, the need to address climate change. And so I'll let him talk a bit more about that. But first, just to introduce Dr. Cleveland. Dr. Cleveland is a professor of Earth and Environment, as well as Associate Director of the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. His research and teaching focus on the connection between energy, climate change, and sustainability. He also recently served as the principal investigator for Carbon Free Boston, which was a technical assessment of strategies to assist the city of Boston in reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. He's the author and editor of reference works on energy that include an award-winning book or reference book called Encyclopedia of Energy. And he's also himself been bestowed with many awards, including recognition for his unique and innovative contributions to the field of energy economics. So we're excited to have him here. I think I'll have a lot of questions for him. I'm sure you will too. So I want to note we'll have a Q&A at the end of the webinar, but please feel free to send your questions at any time, preferably using the Q&A tool, which you can see here in the little blue chat box or the little blue text box. But you can also send me a chat directly and I'll get your question in the queue. But with that, I'll let Dr. Cleveland share his screen and get started.
Great. Thanks, Jenny, for that nice, very nice introduction. I appreciate it. And I noted that the topic today connects directly with some of the projects you mentioned that are up for possible awards this year. So there's some clear connection between the folks in your organization and what we'll be talking about today. As you mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the results of a recent report that we have produced at the Institute for Sustainable Energy with our partners on the impacts of the pandemic on city climate action. And I will hit some of the highlights of that, and I believe you'll share some information where people can find more on those reports at our website at the end of the talk. As you described, I participated in an effort here at Boston University with a number of colleagues last year for the Green Ribbon Commission and the City of Boston to assess how the city can reach its goal of being carbon neutral by 2050.
Dr. Cleveland, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're not actually sharing your screen right now. I just wanted to make sure you knew that.
Okay. Thank you for... Let's see here. I thought that I clicked share.
There you go. Now it's coming up.
Great.
You got it.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
So, as you mentioned, here are the title of two reports we did last year. And the Carbon-Free Boston was an assessment, a technical assessment of how the city could reach carbon neutrality by 2050, which is a goal that it has set for itself. And so we took a deep dive into buildings and transportation and waste management and energy supply and looked at strategies on how it could reach that target through things such as improved energy efficiency in buildings, procuring clean electricity, shifting people out of private vehicles to public transit, and so on. At the same time, we use social equity as an important lens through which we did the work. And we produced a companion report that you see there on the right, which examined how you do that with, at a minimum, not making inequity worse, but hopefully improve equity outcomes. For example, how do you decarbonize 90,000 buildings in a way that doesn't harm households of color and low income, households with a lot of elderly population or low English proficiency? And so we looked at one of the key takeaways there is that you really have to lead not only with how do I reduce emissions, but how do I improve equity outcomes and reduce emissions at the same time. It is a gross understatement to say that 2020 has made all of this much more challenging. The pandemic has taken a huge medical and mental health toll on the country. We've had significant economic disruption, including employment and the largest quarterly contraction in GDP in the nation's history. In cities with public transportation, we've seen ridership evaporate initially when the shutdown started. And at the same time, we've had tremendous social unrest associated with the killing of Black Americans in America's streets at the hands of police. We have set yet again another record for climate fires in the West. But at the same time, we've also seen some possible glimmers of hope and new opportunities. We have seen experiments in cities with safe and slow streets, and a renewed appreciation for the importance of open space for mental and physical health. And so this resulted in the report that I mentioned, what we did in collaboration with the Initiative on Cities here at BU and our partners at the Innovation Network for Communities. So what I'd like to do is to start out with some high-level takeaways from our report, and then dive into some specific action items related to specific behaviors or policies or action. And again, just a reminder that our audience for this report are city climate officials in trying to help them navigate these waters. So one of the important points to take away from the current situation is the important commonalities between COVID-19 and climate change. They are both invisible, they are deadly, and they threaten personal and national security. And they are both exacerbated by the global interconnections of people, information, goods, pollution, and environmental degradation. They both worsen other economic, health, and social ills. Inaction today on either the pandemic or climate change will worsen human and environmental conditions in the future. Both cause large economic losses, and the losses from climate change will accumulate over the coming years at an increasingly rapid rate. They obviously both have a significant impact on physical and mental health, and both cause a disproportionate negative impact on some combination of people of color, low income, and households with children, the elderly, and people with low English proficiency. So, as I mentioned in our social equity report last year, we described how the city's most vulnerable populations could be harmed or helped by action to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And we continue to lead with equity because the events of 2020 underscore that without equitable life opportunities, no community, no city, no country is sustainable. Here's one challenge of the equity impacts of action to reach carbon neutrality. This chart shows along the horizontal axis the percentage of households in the US that report some form of energy insecurity. And by that, I mean households report something such as trouble paying a utility bill, receiving a shutoff notice, heating with a kitchen stove, keeping temperatures lower or higher than preferable, or facing a choice between keeping the lights on and putting food on the table or receiving medical care. And so if you start at the top of the chart, you can see that if you have a low income, if you have a household with children, if you live in an old house, if you rent rather than own, and if you're a person of color, you are much more likely to report energy insecurity than your counterparts. So this is very important in the case of decarbonization, because if one prioritizes the reduction of energy insecurity, that in turn leads to the prioritization of specific strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in buildings in climate action plans. And in particular, an equity focus prioritizes multifamily residences with a high percentage of renters and low income households, because those are the toughest dwellings to make more energy efficient. Another high level takeaway is the importance of emphasizing using science in decision making. Dr. Fauci has been a voice of reason during the pandemic and has championed the use of science in guiding public policy decisions. And on the climate front, former EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy has been a champion of using science in designing climate policy. And so it's important where the opportunity presents itself for cities to really hammer home the point of using science to guide decision making. Another important takeaway is the importance of systems thinking when approaching these interconnected problems. Whether aimed at public health or climate action, any single action ripples through every domain of city life. Some consequences are intended, others are unintended, and oftentimes the unintended consequences are negative and fall on socially vulnerable populations. And those consequences may be delayed in time and be experienced far away from where an action is taken. So let me give you an example of this in the context of our current discussion. A key action item for reducing carbon emissions is energy efficiency in buildings, but which is also impacts public health, such as the risk of infection to something such as the coronavirus. So, if an improvement in energy efficiency improves indoor air quality, there are fewer indoor air pollutants. It also improves thermal comfort. That improves overall health, which lowers the risk of infection. Energy efficiency also reduces the emissions of greenhouse gases and other harmful pollutants, such as particulate matter. Though that reduction in emissions also improves health and therefore reduces the risk of infection, but it also helps the city towards its goal of being carbon neutral. Improved energy efficiency reduces household energy expenditures on fuel and electricity. That improves food security, which also improves public health. So a single measure here has multiple benefits across multiple different outcomes that are of interest to the city. We can expand this one step further. An expansion of green space leads to increased physical exercise, which improves multiple health outcomes and thus also reduces your risk of infection. And so we could expand this into multiple additional outcomes and actions. But the point is, I think you'll see is clear, and that is decision making should be based on an understanding of these interconnections, and it should avoid negative unintended consequences, and it should activate these potential synergies. Simple in concept, you say, but as many of you know, this requires new modes of communication, planning, and budgeting across traditional silos in city halls, such as departments of streets, waste, budget and finance, climate, housing, racial equity, and so on. Oh, I had one other benefit there that I forgot to show. An expansion of green space also reduces stormwater runoff, which also reduces the severity of flooding. So now you have a climate adaptation benefit as well. As planners, you know that a key to closing equity gaps and reaching climate goals is the direct participation by the impacted communities in development and implementation of policies that directly impact them. The key actors include city staff, community-based organizations, philanthropic partners, and facilitative leaders that are trusted by the impacted communities. With the exception of marginalization, each of the steps along this spectrum are essential for building capacity for community collaboration and governance. Communities that understand and move through these developmental stages can break the cycle of perpetual advocacy for basic needs that many communities find themselves in. Okay, so those were some high level takeaways from our report. Now I'd like to delve into some specific things that opportunities that present themselves to cities as they try to maintain momentum on climate and other sustainability goals in the current environment. One is the importance of and capacity to maintain momentum on clean energy. The economic contraction caused by the pandemic disrupted energy markets and led to the postponement or cancellation of some renewable energy projects. However, the long run prospects for clean energy are extremely strong and in many ways have been strengthened by the pandemic. For example, the demise of coal is accelerating, due in part because it's more expensive to operate and has less flexibility than some renewable generation. The cost advantage of electricity from wind and solar compared to fossil fuels and nuclear will continue to widen. And cities have an opportunity to communicate the significant health benefits of clean energy. Due to these and other forces, many states and countries are linking economic recovery to investment in clean energy and energy efficiency. As we all know, the movement of Americans suddenly dropped when schools and businesses closed and stay-at-home orders were issued this past spring. All modes of transportation declined, but public transit ridership really took a hit and dropped by as much as 90% in some cities. This chart shows the number of calls made to Apple Maps for directions by transport mode relative to January 14th. So this is not an exact measurement of the actual use of these different modes, but it's probably quite an accurate indicator of the general trend in the use of these different modes of transportation. And you can see that in late April, late March and early April, people stopped moving a lot across all modes, but notice that public transit dropped the most. People's fear of obviously tight enclosed spaces where they could not social distance really drove people away from public transit. Note as things started to open up, people started driving and walking more, but notice how the use of transit has lagged. This is a real challenge for many cities due to the importance of of transit for moving people and to the revenue dependence they get from ridership. So this is a real challenge that cities face, and along with their regional partners, cities will need to develop new sources of funding, such as congestion pricing, and commit to a robust public campaign to convince people that it is safe to get back on a bus or a train. They will also need to take measures to ensure that the safety of people who drive the buses and maintain the subways, who are often people of color. In many cities, more than half of the real estate is devoted to cars in their infrastructure. So, why is this the case? Well, this is obviously a long and complicated story, but certainly one factor is our compulsion to drive, an explanation that would require deep social psychoanalysis that I'm not going to go into, and I'm not qualified to go into. But one result of that is that a huge amount of space in cities is gobbled up to support cars. This shows the amount of space measured in square feet required to support a car, a transit bus at some average mode of passenger density, a bicycle, and a pedestrian. And you can see that in a city, a car going 20 miles an hour needs 400 square feet of space. This includes parking and shoulders of the road, and so on. And you can see that a bus and active modes of transport require far less space. So, not surprisingly, during the pandemic, when the streets were empty, some cities started to say, what could we do with all this space if it weren't filled up with moving cars? And so you had cities experimenting with turning over more use of the space to walking, biking, socializing, and dining. You see on the left there a Safe and Slow Street program in Oakland, which had some very impressive expansion of its Safe and Slow Streets program. Making these changes permanent and expanding them would reduce congestion, strengthen communities, it would spur economic recovery, improve mental and physical health, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Plastic pollution has surged during the pandemic, and recycling supply chains have been significantly disrupted. We go into this in some depth in the report. I'm not going to say too much about it here, so I would refer you to the report. But I will say that cities that think about waste from a systems and life cycle perspective understand that zero waste generates multiple economic, environmental, health, and environmental justice benefits. Food security has become a major issue during the pandemic. It was already a major issue for many people in the United States because prior to the pandemic, 1 in 9 households experienced food insecurity in the US. And that rate of food insecurity is about the same as it was a quarter century ago. It's an intransigent problem in this country. Households of color and low income bear the brunt of this pernicious condition. This map shows projections generated by the organization called Feeding America for heightened food insecurity in 2020. This is county level data. And the darker colors represent higher rates of projected food insecurity. They estimate that more than 54 million people, or about 1 in 6 Americans, may experience food insecurity in 2020. And the reasons for food insecurity are complex, but the good news is that we don't need some magic new invention to deal with this issue. Cities already have the means to eliminate this problem through zoning, tax codes, density bonuses, control over parking, and other measures that they already have on hand. The Federal Communication Commission estimates that about 7% of Americans lack access to broadband internet, although there are other independent analyses that suggest the actual number is probably much higher than that. This chart shows the percent of households with wired internet access or broadband internet access by race and ethnicity. And you can see that people of color have 30 to 40% lower rates of service compared to white Americans. And so, again, working with public and private organizations, this is something that cities can and should really tackle because more teleworking and online education raise the stakes for everyone, but especially for people of color in low income households and those in rural areas. And you might ask, well, what does this have to do with climate change and clean energy and so on? And in fact, not only will closing this divide shrink the gaps in education and social connectivity, it will improve access to information on clean energy, energy efficiency, transportation services, home energy use, waste reduction, health, and climate resiliency. So prior to the pandemic, this is what Boston looks like every morning during the work week. This is Interstate 93 coming into the city from the south. And this is what it looked like every day. And many of these trips, obviously, like everywhere else in the country, were eliminated as people shifted to telework. And a significant portion of the increase in telework may be permanent, which will have profound implications for throughout society. Now, conventional wisdom holds that the elimination of such trips will reduce fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions. But in fact, as I'll show you in a moment, the net effect on energy use and emissions is unclear. And the reason for this is straightforward in principle. The expansion of telework will reduce fuel use by private vehicles and commuting, such as the ones you see here. But it will expand energy use in the home and in local trips for the people who telework. And to understand this, we need to put on our systems thinking cap. So let's look at a particular city like Boston, where we've done a lot of work. So the city over here on the right-hand side is interested in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions released in its city that they keep track of. They want to get to zero by 2050. Well, over on the left, you have the number of people working at home. So as that increases, the amount of fuel used by those cars declines, which has a positive effect on our greenhouse gas emissions in the inventory. That is, the emissions go down. Similarly, fewer people in office buildings in Boston means that commercial energy use and emissions will go down. So that effect clearly is a positive for GHG emissions in Boston. But let's say that you drive in from Framingham, which is a community 20 or so miles to the west of Boston. Now you're staying home. And research shows quite clearly that people who telework make a lot more local trips in their home community. So fuel use for driving in Framingham is going to go up. So other things held constant, that's going to increase greenhouse gas emissions in Framingham. We also know that energy use in homes in Framingham will go up. People are working home more, so the lights are on, heat and air conditioning will rise as well, which will increase greenhouse gas emissions in Framingham. If we expand the scale of our analysis sort of to the country as a whole, if you aren't driving into work every day, you will perceive that as an increase in your disposable income. And that may be just a perception, or in some cases, it will actually be an increase in your disposable income. Well, what do you do with that money? Some people use it to buy other goods and services, which take energy to produce, and which result in more greenhouse gas emissions in other sectors of the economy. There's also research to support the observation that the productivity of labor and capital tends to rise with more teleworking. We don't know whether this is universal, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of research on this now that teleworking is going to be a much bigger factor in the economy. But if the productivity of labor and capital improve, that is good news for the generation of GDP. More energy is used to generate overall GDP in the country, and emissions rise. So the net effect of this, while it may be positive for Boston, overall, there's no clear sense yet of what the overall impact on greenhouse gas emissions will be from teleworking. Another important issue related to telework relates to equity. Who can actually telework? In an article published this summer in The Conversation, we described how the work at home benefit is tied to certain occupations in certain sectors of the economy that have high incomes and people with college degrees. These jobs have low representation people of color. So here's some work by the National Bureau of Economic Research, who looked at all the different occupations in the country and said, potentially, what fraction of the people in these sectors could telework? And you can see that some sectors, such as software and computing, higher education, legal professions, business and finance, have a high potential for full teleworking, whereas others, such as healthcare support, construction, food services, building maintenance, have little or no potential to telework. And this is important because many of those jobs that have no potential to telework are held by people with low incomes or people of color. So while there will always be some jobs that obviously can't be done remotely, you can't build a new building at home from home, obviously, but More equitable access to workplace benefits, such as telework, requires the addressing of historical biases in housing, hiring, education, and healthcare that created the current workforce composition. And this is something that cities need to keep in mind as they struggle to understand the other impacts of telework. The pandemic has has generated a lot of discussion about the pros and cons about living in cities, and around, in particular, around population density. And the early outbreak of the coronavirus in Wuhan, Milan, and New York City led some to conclude that population density is the villain. There's a headline from the New York Times describing density as the big enemy. Governor Cuomo, who is lauded by many for his overall handling of the pandemic, called population density destructive. And over on the other coast, apparently some folks in the Los Angeles area think that suburban sprawl, because of its higher density, provides a protection against the coronavirus. Well, this is an age-old discussion, and the benefits such as higher productivity and wages, increased social connection, and the drawbacks, congestion, pollution, crime, of cities have been debated since they first emerged during the Neolithic Revolution some 12,000 years ago. And through the 19th century, cities could be unhealthy places to live compared to rural areas, at least in terms of infectious diseases and exposure to pollution. So here's a photograph of late 19th century England. See a lot of pollution there. The tall stacks with the black smoke that's coal combustion, and the shorter stacks with the white smoke is probably wood combustion, all of which are spewing lots of very unhealthy air pollutants into the air. But the situation has now flipped. Compared to rural residents, today's urban residents live longer and are healthier than rural residents due to more physical activity, better access to healthcare, and other factors. And this urban health benefit is the largest for people of color. So this is county level data for the US, covering about 105 million deaths across 3,000 counties over this roughly 25-year period, no, close to 50-year period. And you can see that the death rate per 1,000 people between rural and urban regions has steadily widened. We do know pretty unequivocally that there's a greenhouse gas benefit to dense living and dense economic activity. This is some work done by Chris Jones and Dan Kamen at Berkeley, where they calculated the greenhouse gas intensity of life in every major metropolitan area. And what they did was calculate it at a zip code level. ZCTA refers to zip code. So every one of those colored polygons there is a zip code. And they calculated the amount of greenhouse gas emissions released per household by zip code. And here you see a map of the greater Atlanta region. And the red colors indicate higher levels of greenhouse gas emissions per household. And the inner black polygon is the city proper itself of Atlanta. The outer black polygon is the metropolitan area of Atlanta, and those black concentric rings are 5-mile rings. And what this shows is that in the dense city center, emissions per household are very, very low relative to, as you move outward on those rings, get to more sprawling suburbia, and emissions tend to increase and can be substantially higher than they are in the urban inner core. And as you undoubtedly will have already deduced, a lot of that has to do with a much greater dependence on automobiles for transportation in suburbia relative to dense urban centers where people use more public transportation, or they walk and they bike, or they just travel less in general. And so the formula for a city that maximizes the life enhancing benefits of density while minimizing its costs is, as you know better than I do, complex and elusive in practice. But we do know where to aim. Density done right is embodied in the notion of compact cities, an urban form that encourages cycling and walking, enhances public transport, mixes land use, maintains accessibility to local services and jobs, and builds enough housing to give an affordable toehold to those who want access to the opportunities these places have to offer. So, with that, I'll turn things back to Jenny. Hopefully, I've given you some things to think about, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have. And again, thanks for the opportunity to engage in this important discussion.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cleveland. I thought that was really interesting. It was yeah, I appreciated everything you said, and I think we do have some questions here that I'd like to get to. But before we do that, I just want to let everyone know. I just put in the chat box. There was a question about whether we'll be making the recording available. Yes, we will be making a recording available. I posted the link to our blog site, our WordPress site, in the attendee chat, so you can look at it there. We'll also put a PDF, so that should be available in the coming days. There were a couple of questions related to the, let's see, going back to the systems map. Or maybe I can just pull up that slide on my end. Would that work,
Sure.
Dr. Cleveland? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
I think it'll be helpful maybe to have this pulled up and where. Let's see.
The systems diagrams always generate a lot of discussion.
This does not seem to be wanting to work on my end, of course. Here we go. Excuse me, everyone, as I navigate through. We can all remember the presentation here. Okay, so there were a couple of questions about this. I think it was around this slide. And so one question was, is the assumption that local trips increase when you're teleworking, does that consider that many people who are teleworking are also quarantining or social distancing and maybe staying home more than in typical times? So I guess how does that assumption come out that there's more local trips? Are there data that's showing that?
That's a great question, and I should have qualified that. So the research that we looked at was pre-pandemic research. So the short answer is no. It does not account for staying at home due to the pandemic. The sort of assumption that we made is that we're going to come out of this on the other side, and stay-at-home orders will be lifted. The work that we looked at teleworking that's from around the world prior to the pandemic. And what it shows is that when people work at home, they make more local trips for a variety of reasons. One reason is that if you live in a car-constrained household, let's say you have one car and multiple licensed drivers, if that car is suddenly now sitting out in the driveway, it tends to get driven more. People also tend to make more trips in total when they're working at home, sometimes due to just because they're bored or whatever it may be. Oh, I'm going to run down to Starbucks and get a coffee or something like that. There's also a connection to when you don't when you commute, people often daisy chain trips coming home or going to work. So they'll stop at the pharmacy, or they'll stop at the dry cleaner, they'll stop at the gym or whatever it might be. And many of those become separate trips when you drive it home. So those are the forces that tend to increase travel. And in the long run, if you're able to telework, there's evidence suggests that people will tend to live further away from where they work. So if you're telecommuting 3 days a week, those 2 days that you go in now might be longer trips. So that's why there's a lot of uncertain debate about what the net effect was. But again, the underlying assumption that I didn't state is that people will not be staying in their homes on a permanent basis due to for health concerns.
Okay, thanks for that. We had a couple other questions around this, and I think one of them is sort of technical questions, what's being showed here. And as you said, there's maybe always a lot of questions around these types of charts, but looking specifically at the lines leading to greenhouse gas emissions in Boston inventory, where there's it says there's positive symbols plus symbols. There was some questions, and I also had this question on my end actually. Should those, I mean, in my mind, there's maybe having a minus there would make more sense if fuel use and commute.
Yeah, so this is one of the I glossed over this. So this is, I use these techniques a lot in my classes, but what those are describing are functional relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so if take energy use in Boston offices and put that on a vertical axis, and take greenhouse gas emissions along the horizontal axis, and if you plotted that, it would be a it would be a line that goes upwards. It would have a positive slope. As you use more energy use in Boston offices, greenhouse gas emissions go up. As you use less energy use, greenhouse gas emissions go down. So that's a positive relationship.
Mm.
That's what that means.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Um, let's see. One other thing I think on this slide, just sort of a talking point, someone mentioned, if with increased local travel or maybe increased working locally, not commuting, that might provide more of an opportunity for increased walking, biking, and transit travel. So then the outcome might be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think that maybe goes hand in hand with what you talked about initially, which is the assumptions maybe that go into what does it look like to work from home before COVID versus now.
So the question is, working at home would increase increased travel provides opportunity for walking, bike, and that could be if those opportunities are available. Uh, in the if those opportunities are available in your community where you're teleworking from,
Mhm.
so it could. But if you live in suburbia, oftentimes uh, it may not. I mean, you can obviously always just go out the door and walk, but are there safe places to bike
Right.
in these areas? And this is America, and the research does actually show that, as I mentioned, people often get in their car to do something. So,
Mhm.
um, but the question is a good one, and this research, there's probably 100 people around the world now who are going back and diving into this analysis now that
Right.
we have this the game has been changed. So there's a lot to be figured out yet.
Right. Great. Well, I'll dive back in some questions. I just want to make sure we go back to the contact slide so people have your info here. Um, one question that came up, and we've got quite a few here, but one that I'd be interested in your opinion on is, has there been research to suggest how increased teleworking might impact the housing decisions people will make, especially regards to increased sprawl or density based on necessity to commute?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And again, I don't think we know the answer to that. Um, what we do know is that due to concerns, perceptions of density, there is a flight out of some cities, which is, of course, enabled in some cases by the potential to telework by those people involved. But we also know that if people can telework, people who already live maybe close in a suburb that's close to the city may move further out where housing prices are lower if they know that they can telework. So
Mhm.
the actual impact of this is, to be determined, and I'm sure will be is already under analysis. Well, it'll unfold as we get more data.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Let's see here. There was a question, you talked about transit and the impacts on transit, and I personally thought that sort of data showing the change in how people are looking for trips, walking and driving versus transit, and the change, that shows a pretty drastic change. Um, Someone had a question about, are there specific, examples of tactics to save transit that, you think might be the most promising, or that you've heard about? Any example municipalities, for example?
Uh, I don't know have any specific examples that have actually been implemented, but I know the short run challenges. Well, there are two very short run challenges. One is funding,
Mhm.
and the other one is public, real and perceived safety. And so I know that in Boston and in other areas, in some other cities, they are making a strong sort of public relations campaign to demonstrate to people their commitment to making to disinfection and making the subways clean. They are also adding routes and more cars and trying to make them make more services available to people to get them back. The tougher challenge, or an equally tough one, is the revenue. And so people are looking at, what are some additional ways in which we can generate revenue, either through traditional funding lines and state and regional budgets, or thinking about raising parking fees or congestion fees. These are politically very challenging options, but they do have the potential to raise significant amounts of money that could be directed to public transit and also reduce congestion and the other downsides of lots of vehicle traffic.
Great, thank you. I want to switch topics a bit in our remaining time. There were some questions about air quality, um, and I want to kind of tie them all together. So one thing was, we looked at that map, the greenhouse gas emission map around Atlanta, and there's a question of whether there's sort of maps like that that show air quality in a similar way, and I think that's kind of tied together with the question of, has the conversation about air quality in denser communities, does that come into that research looking at density, particularly in relation to impacts on people of color?
Yes, there's been a lot of work on that, and at BU we're lucky to have a excellent school of public health, which has a whole department of environmental health and some scholars that have really looked at the impacts of air quality, and it relates mostly to particulate matter, and which is a real respiratory hazard, and ozone. And the research shows at a variety of scales in a variety of different regions in the country that people of color disproportionately suffer from higher levels of particulate matter and ozone because of where they live. They tend to be near highways and tend to be near industrial facilities and other facilities where they're exposed to a greater health risk. So that's a very well established uh, uh, disparity. And so there's where the synergies that I mentioned really come in, because getting people out of cars or electrifying cars with clean electricity, more active in public transport, not only helps you reach your carbon neutrality goals, but it produces health outcomes overall, and that disproportionately, by definition, based on what I just said, accrue to people of color.
And then, thank you. And then, relatedly, there was a question about, you had mentioned that energy efficiency improves indoor air quality, but someone mentioned, is weatherization a better term or solution when referring to health outcomes? Should we be talking about weatherization instead of necessarily energy efficiency?
Yes. So, weatherization is is part of the palette of energy efficient measures in buildings. And so, in the technical report for carbon-free Boston, we looked at a wide range of measures to improve the overall energy efficiency of buildings, commercial buildings and residences. Actually, we had 15 different building archetypes, and so weatherization is one of those. Improved lighting and better furnaces and heating HVAC systems, all the way up to full-blown building retrofits, and we assessed all of those. So that I use an umbrella term there for all of those measures that reduce the amount of energy you need to heat and cool your building.
Okay, got it. That makes sense. Let's see. We have a few minutes left. I want to touch on a couple of things that we already talked about, but sort of I mentioned some other clarifying questions around those. So, one thing we talked about earlier was that sort of systems graphic that showed the impacts of teleworking or working from home. Um, and you had mentioned that the data shows that, pre-COVID at least, local trips or working from home result in more local trips. Um, is that, let's see, let me just show the question to make sure I'm saying it correctly.
The short answer is, we looked at about 30 or so studies that looked at the impacts, and I don't remember the actual ratios, but a majority of the studies show a higher VMT at home compared to that. Overall vehicle miles traveled per household rise when you shift to working at home.
Hmm. That would certainly not have been my initial assumption, so that's really interesting to hear. Um, Thank you for that. Let's see. There's a couple of big questions that I don't think we can answer all today, but I want to touch on since they were submitted. And I think for this question, this might be more of if you have resources, you can connect us to. But the question of, how, recognizing that low income people are maybe largely affected by the climate crisis, and question of how they can come out from that impact. Are there particular resources that you might suggest? Obviously, you can't necessarily answer this in full right now, but any thoughts on how to look into that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and this uh, speaks to the one slide which I didn't spend much time on, which was the community engagement part.
Mm,
And it's a real challenge for cities to to effectively communicate with and engage and prioritize the concerns of frontline communities. And all I can in summary, what I could do is share with you a resource of a good example of how to do this, and that is the City of Providence recently released a climate justice uh, program where they essentially approach climate adaptation and mitigation not from how do we harden our infrastructure against flooding and reduce emissions, but how do we improve the conditions of the cities most vulnerable while also doing those things. And it was all about, it led not with technical work, but with community engagement. And so I can provide that resource, or if you just, search for City of Providence Climate Justice Plan, you will find that. And that's, I think, in a short answer, the best resource I could think of.
that I think is a perfect answer, and I googled it. I just pasted it into the chat, so everyone should have
Oh,
access to
there you
that.
go.
So thank you for
Real,
that. I'm interested to look at that myself. So anyway, we're at 1 o'clock. So that was a really great Q&A. I think we touched on most of the questions. So thank you everyone for those great questions, and thank you Dr. Cleveland for being on and walking through that. Everyone can see here there's a link to the report if you want to learn more, as well as the contact info for Dr. Cleveland and for the division. So thank you again, Dr. Cleveland, and thank you to you all.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks. Have a good day, everyone.